Imagine a quiet summer night in 1912. The doors to your home are on log. The crickets are chirping outside.
Right, a totally peaceful scene.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You and your family are walking back from a local church event, completely at ease in this town where, everyone knows everyone. You step inside, you turn down the lamps, and you put your kids to bed.
Yeah.
But what you don't know, what you couldn't possibly fathom, is that someone is already inside your house.
Oh, that is just terrifying.
It really is. And they are waiting in the absolute dark. Welcome to your custom deep dive. Today we're pulling from a fascinating and honestly deeply unsettling piece of source material. It's an article titled Shadows of the Axe, the Villisca Household Tragedy.
Yeah, and it's a remarkable piece of history to explore because, well, it forces us to confront a moment when the fabric of American society fundamentally changed. I mean, we were looking at a time way before the concept of the serial killer was widely understood by the public.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack the mechanics of this century-old unsolved mystery. We want to analyze the deeply bizarre psychology of an unidentified killer, examine how a total failure of the early justice system essentially birthed modern criminal profiling.
Exactly.
And we'll look at how an unresolved trauma transforms a physical crime scene into like a permanent psychological monument.
Yeah, to really grasp the gravity of this event, we have to look at the baseline of innocence in Villisca, Iowa on June 10th, 1912. This wasn't just a quiet town. It operated on an entirely different social contract than we have today.
Right. Think about what it means to genuinely never lock your doors. Like, ever.
It implies this agrarian trust system.
Yeah.
The people of Villisca didn't possess the mental framework for random malicious violence. Crime, if it happened, was, a bar fight or a stolen horse.
Right. It was an interpersonal dispute between people who actually knew each other. The idea of a phantom threat just slipping into a home in the dark, it just didn't exist in their daily reality.
No, not at all. And that idyllic setting provides the crucial contrast for the scale of the violence that was about to unfold at the Moore household.
So let's set up who was there. That evening, there were 8 people sleeping in the house.
8 people?
Yeah. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 young children, and 2 neighborhood sisters who had asked to stay overnight after the church function.
6 of those 8 people were children.
Which is just awful. And the timeline of how the crime unfolded introduces a mechanical detail that is just viscerally terrifying. Okay, let's unpack this. Investigators later pieced together that the killer didn't simply break in at like 2 a.m. while everyone was asleep.
Right.
The evidence points to the intruder entering the house much earlier in the evening and physically hiding inside, waiting, before the Moore family even returned home.
What's fascinating here is the psychology required for that waiting period. It's staggering.
It's literally the monster hiding under the bed,
Yeah,
right? Like that universal childhood fear becoming historical reality.
Exactly. If we break down the mechanics of a typical violent crime, it's usually driven by a sudden spike in adrenaline, a loss of emotional control, or, an immediate need, like a robbery gone wrong.
Right.
But to infiltrate a home and sit in the shadows for hours.
You're talking about listening to a family walk through the front door, listening to them talk, maybe have a late-night snack, heard the kids upstairs, tuck them in, and then waiting for the house to go completely silent.
Yeah, that requires a person to actively suppress their own adrenaline for a sustained period of time. It requires an almost unthinkable level of calculated patience.
Just sitting there in the pitch black.
The killer had to listen to the floorboards settle, wait for the breathing of 8 separate people to deepen into REM sleep, and remain perfectly still. This completely rules out a spontaneous crime of passion.
Absolutely.
It indicates a predator who was highly organized, very comfortable in the dark, and entirely committed to the act of a massacre long before the first blow was struck.
And when the violence finally did happen, sometime after midnight, it was swift. But here is a detail that stands out to me.
Mm-hmm.
The killer didn't even bring a weapon.
Yeah, that's wild.
They used an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore, something they likely just found in the yard or the coal shed.
The fact that they used a weapon of opportunity from the scene itself is a really fascinating behavioral clue.
How so?
Well, it could suggest confidence, like the killer knew they could find a lethal tool on a rural property. Or it could suggest a level of improvisation that sort of contrasts with the intense premeditation of hiding in the house.
Fine.
But regardless of the origin of the weapon, the execution was remarkably systematic.
Yeah, the source text notes that all 8 victims were murdered in their sleep, suffering devastating head wounds. It happened so violently and so quickly that investigators found no signs of a struggle.
Almost immediate.
Most of the victims were attacked so suddenly, they never even had a chance to scream.
Which is horrifying. But while the patience of the killer was chilling, it was the killer's bizarre behavior after the murders that truly baffled investigators.
The post-murder routine.
Yeah. This is where the profile of the killer moves from merely brutal to deeply, deeply bizarre.
Right.
The evidence suggests the killer didn't immediately flee into the night, which is, the standard biological response to committing extreme violence. Instead, they stayed.
They walked through the dark hallways. They took pieces of clothing and cloth to systematically cover the mirrors throughout the house.
Yeah.
They covered the faces of some of the victims. They took the time to block the windows so no light could get in or out. And reports show they actually went into the kitchen, ate a plate of food, and likely washed their hands in a basin before eventually walking out the door.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
So what does this all mean? I mean, how does someone massacre 8 people and then casually sit down for a snack in the same house? What kind of psychological disconnect allows for that level of domestic normalcy surrounded by carnage?
If you visualize the reality of that space, a house containing 8 brutalized bodies, and a person casually navigating it, eating a meal, it indicates an unprecedented level of environmental control.
Yeah.
After an event like that, the human body usually experiences a massive adrenaline crash. You see panic, erratic behavior, a desperate need to escape the geography of the crime.
Right, flight response.
Exactly. This individual felt entirely safe. They turned a scene of unspeakable horror into a casual environment.
Okay, wait, I want to push back on that psychological profile for a second.
Sure.
If we are looking at a killer who sits down to eat a plate of food and wash their hands, couldn't that simply mean we're dealing with a transient who is literally starving? Like, why jump to the conclusion of a calculated mastermind when the behavior might just point to a desperate, impoverished drifter who got caught in the house, panicked, committed the crime, and then saw a full pantry and a sink?
That is a very sound counter theory, and it's one that investigators definitely had to wrestle with. A starving transient would absolutely take advantage of food. However, the forensic logic pushes back against a panicked burglar scenario.
Why is that?
Well, if a desperate drifter is surprised by a returning family, the resulting crime scene usually reflects chaos. You'd see signs of a frantic search for valuables, defensive wounds from a struggle, a messy, immediate escape.
Oh, I see.
But the Villisca scene was methodical. The systematic execution of 8 people in different rooms without raising a single alarm, combined with the ritualistic covering of the mirrors and faces, it points to a psychological motive rather than purely a material one. A panicked burglar doesn't take the time to drape cloth over a mirror.
That's true. The mirror covering is such a specific, intentional act. It definitely moves the needle from burglary gone wrong to something much darker.
Definitely.
And ironically, that extreme calmness the killer felt, that unhurried exit, is precisely what triggered the absolute panic that gripped the town of Villisca the next morning.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when a neighbor noticed the house was entirely silent and the animals hadn't been fed, they called Josiah's brother. He used his own key to open the door, and what he found shattered the town's reality permanently.
It was a massive paradigm shift. You have to understand, the news of this didn't just cause sadness. It triggered a communal terror that fundamentally altered how people lived.
The era of unlocked doors ended that very afternoon. I mean, hardware stores completely sold out of locks and bolts.
Yeah.
Families began sleeping in the same room, taking shifts, staying awake with loaded shotguns. Parents refused to let their children out of their sight. The illusion of safety was just permanently broken.
And the logic was cold and undeniable. If a monster could slip into the Moore home and wipe out a family without a single warning cry, then the concept of safety was an illusion.
Right.
That loss of innocence is profound. But from a historical and legal perspective, that sheer collective panic had catastrophic consequences for the investigation.
Yeah, really did.
Because the town was so terrified and so desperate to understand what happened, they didn't wait for the authorities to manage the situation.
The investigation was ruined on day one. I mean, we read about the botched investigation, but it's hard to overstate just how bad it was. Word spread through Villisca, and before noon, dozens of curious, horrified townspeople literally walked into the house.
They were wandering through the rooms, staring at the victims, touching door frames, moving objects.
Which is insane. I just can't get over the sheer absurdity of the townspeople's actions.
Yeah.
I mean, how could authorities allow random neighbors to take a sightseeing tour through a gruesome mass murder scene.
I know, we look at that today and it seems incomprehensibly negligent.
It does.
But we have to contextualize the era. In 1912, modern forensic science and the strict concept of securing a crime scene simply didn't exist in a small, innocent town that had never faced anything like this.
Oh, right.
Local law enforcement was equipped to handle, like, public drunkenness or property theft. They had never faced a mass casualty event.
And the science of catching a killer was incredibly primitive, right? Fingerprinting was technically a known concept, but it was really only being utilized in major metropolitan hubs like New York or London.
Precisely. A rural sheriff in Iowa wasn't carrying a dust kit. They relied on obvious physical clues, a dropped hat, an eyewitness, a known grievance.
Which they didn't have here.
No. And when the townspeople trampled the house, they erased any subtle physical footprint the killer might have left. Any distinct boot print in the dust, any smudge of blood on a doorknob, any spatial reasoning of how the killer moved through the house. It was all destroyed by 100 overlapping sets of footprints and fingerprints.
So, because the physical evidence was wiped out on day one, it forced the investigators into a corner. Without hard proof, they had to rely on a tool that was still in its absolute infancy: psychological profiling and circumstantial theory.
Right, which kicked off a desperate multi-year scramble to find a suspect based on theory rather than proof.
Yeah, and the source material highlights three main avenues they pursued.
The first major suspect to emerge was a traveling preacher who happened to be in Villisca during the murders. His behavior in the aftermath was highly erratic, drawing immediate suspicion.
Right.
And the most compelling piece of the case against him was that, under intense interrogation, he actually offered a brief confession to the murders.
But then he completely retracted it later.
Right.
Which is crazy. Like, if you are innocent, why on earth would you confess to the brutal murder of 8 people? It seems completely counterintuitive.
It does.
But false confessions are a very real, documented mechanical flaw in our justice system, especially in the early 20th century.
The mechanics of a false confession are fascinating and tragic. In an era before Miranda rights, before limits on interrogation lengths, suspects were often subjected to extreme psychological and physical pressure.
Yeah.
Sleep deprivation, isolation, and the sweatbox technique were common. If you take an individual who might be mentally fragile or seeking notoriety, and you apply unrelenting pressure, their brain will sometimes offer a confession simply as a survival mechanism to make the immediate stress stop.
They just want to sleep.
Right, they convince themselves that cooperating will somehow set them free.
And the grand jury ultimately refused to indict him, likely realizing the confession was entirely coerced and unsupported by any physical evidence.
Exactly.
Which led investigators to a second suspect. This was a man reported to have severe mental instability. But what made him highly intriguing was a potential connection to a wider geographic pattern.
This is where the scope of the investigation expanded beyond the town limits. Investigators began looking at a string of very similar, unsolved axe murders occurring across the Midwest during that same general time frame.
Families being murdered in their sleep, often with a weapon found on site, sometimes with mirrors or windows covered.
Right.
This mentally unstable suspect had ties to some of the affected areas, but again, no definitive link could be proven. However, recognizing that regional pattern birthed the third and frankly most terrifying theory of the case.
The chilling theory of a transient serial killer using the train system to travel between towns committing nighttime attacks.
This completely changes the scale of the threat. I mean, you have to look at the expanding American railway system in 1912. The trains were the internet of their day. They connected isolated rural communities to the wider world. But they also brought a totally unprecedented level of anonymity.
It created a mechanism for a new type of crime. Before the extensive rail network, a stranger arriving in a small town was immediately noticed. You couldn't easily enter and leave a community without interacting with the locals.
But with the trains, a killer could step off a boxcar in Villisca at midnight, walk a few blocks into a sleeping neighborhood, commit an atrocity, and be back on a train moving 50 miles an hour toward a different state before the sun even came up.
Yeah.
The jurisdiction ended at the county line, but the killer was already 3 counties away.
It perfectly fit the methodology we see in the Villisca case. The sudden appearance, the complete lack of local ties or discernible motive, and the clean, untraceable escape. The rail network inadvertently provided the perfect circulatory system for a predator.
If you think about it, it's like a real-life, early 20th century urban legend. The idea of a phantom menace, riding the rails in the dead of night, bringing death to random towns. it became the ultimate boogeyman.
Oh, for sure.
When a community suffers a senseless trauma, and there is no known face to put to the evil, we are forced to invent an archetype. You need a boogeyman to give shape to the dark, to explain why bad things happen to good people.
It's a vital psychological defense mechanism. If the killer is a mythical, transient monster, then the town doesn't have to face the terrifying possibility that the murderer was a neighbor they saw at the grocery store.
Wow, yeah.
But despite all these theories, despite the arrests, the grand juries, and the endless interrogations, no one was ever convicted. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the failure to find a motive or a fingerprint meant the town never got justice, leaving an open psychological wound.
And when a tragedy of this magnitude has no legal resolution, it doesn't just fade into a history textbook. The lack of closure forces the history to transform into enduring folklore.
Which brings us to the modern legacy of the physical crime scene itself. The house where the Moore family and the visiting sisters lost their lives still stands today.
Known as the Villisca Axe Murder House. It has become a massive draw for paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and people seeking proximity to a dark mystery.
Yeah, and the claims of what happens inside those walls are extensive.
Right. Visitors report hearing the distinct sound of disembodied footsteps pacing the upstairs bedrooms when the house is empty.
There are frequent reports of physical anomalies, too. Doors unlatching and swinging open on their own. Everyday objects allegedly moving across tables when no one is looking. Audio recordings capturing what sounds like children's voices whispering in the dark.
And the physiological reactions are very common. People who pay to spend a night there frequently report waking up to a sensation of overwhelming, suffocating dread, or feeling a sudden drastic drop in temperature in the specific room where the children slept.
Yeah.
And of course, the visual claims reports of silent shadow figures standing near the doorways, just watching the beds.
The house has effectively become a focal point for those trying to capture empirical evidence of haunting activity.
Yeah, but let's look at the skeptics' argument for a second, because it's rooted entirely in human psychology. They argue that the hauntings are just imagination fueled by the dark history.
It's known as the priming effect.
Exactly. I want you to consider how knowing the history of a room physically changes how your brain processes sensory data. If you walk into a 100-year-old house not knowing anything about it and you hear a creak, your brain registers it as wood settling.
Right.
But if you walk into that same house knowing 8 people were brutally murdered there, your brain is actively scanning for a threat. Suddenly, that normal floorboard creak isn't structural settling, it's a ghost. A shadow cast by a passing car isn't headlights, it's a dark figure. Your imagination is hijacked by the history.
The environment is incredibly loaded with suggestion. Pareidolia takes over, causing the brain to find meaningful patterns in random visual or auditory noise. But whether a visitor is experiencing a literal paranormal event or they are experiencing a psychological manifestation of their own deeply ingrained fears, the cultural function of the house remains exactly the same.
It serves as a monument.
Yes. When you strip away the ghost stories and the thrill-seeking tourism, the most deeply disturbing aspect of the Villisca Axe murders isn't paranormal at all.
No.
It's the factual silence left behind. It is a reality that a human being walked into an ordinary home, extinguished 8 lives, and then casually walked out the door into the darkness forever. No motive was ever established, no justice was ever served. The house stands as a monument to the vanished killer.
And more than a century later, people are still walking through those exact same rooms, trying to comprehend the sheer terror of that summer night. So let's recap the journey of this deep dive.
Sounds good.
We started in the peaceful, trusting environment of 1912 Villisca, an era of unlocked doors. We broke down the chilling, terrifying premeditation of a hidden killer waiting in the dark. We analyzed how the town's sheer panic led to the tragic bungling of the crime scene.
Right.
And we explored how that forced the creation of profiling, giving rise to theories of a train-riding boogeyman, and ultimately how the absence of justice birthed the modern-day ghost stories that try to fill the void.
It's a profound study of how an unresolved trauma echoes through generations. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final haunting concept to explore on your own.
Okay.
It builds on that bizarre detail about the post-murder routine, the deliberate covering of the mirrors.
Right. They took cloth and systematically draped it over every reflective surface in the house and even covered the faces of some of the victims.
Well, if we examine historical folklore, covering mirrors immediately after a death is a frantic ritual. In many traditions, it was believed that a mirror could act as a portal. The covering was meant to prevent the souls of the deceased from becoming trapped in the reflection, or to stop the living from accidentally seeing the reflection of the dead. So consider this. What if this ruthless, cold-blooded killer, who had the iron patience to sit in the dark for hours, wasn't acting out of sheer malice in those final hours inside the house?
Wait, really?
What if, as the silence descended and the adrenaline finally faded, the killer was actually gripped by a sudden, overwhelming, superstitious terror of the very victims he had just slaughtered? What if draping the cloth over the mirrors was the frantic panic of a man terrified that the souls of the Moore family were watching him?
That is an incredibly haunting perspective. The idea of a killer suddenly terrified of his own ghosts, trying to blind the house before he fled into the night. I encourage you to ponder that chilling possibility the next time you find yourself walking through a quiet, dark room and you happen to catch your own reflection out of the corner of your eye. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. We'll be waiting right here for the next one.